The next topic that we're going to discuss is another bit of syntactic sugar in ES6. So much like the other features we've talked about so far, this is going to be something else that's about just making sure that we write code that's a little bit more cleaner and clear. This topic that we're going to talk about in particular is called default function arguments. As usual, we'll talk about what the new feature is in this section and then discuss the purpose of the feature in the next one. So let's start off by looking at an example. Let's imagine that we are writing a function that should make an AJAX request. The first argument will be the URL that we want to make the request to, and the second argument will be the request method. So like whether it's a get, a put, a post, or a delete, or what have you. So we'll create our function, and we'll call it make AJAX request. And the first argument, like I said, will be a URL, and the second will be a method. And then somewhere in here, you'll have something to say basically logic to make the request. Whatever that might be. We don't really know, don't really care what it is. I'm just going to imagine that we have some logic in there to do it. So every AJAX request that we make must have a method assigned to it. Again, like get, post, or put, and so on. The most common type of AJAX request by far is a get request. So making get requests is so common, in fact, that many AJAX helper libraries will make a get request even if you don't specify it. So by default, it will make a get request. So let's write in some code to see what that might look like. So we're going to assume that if a user has not specified that they want to make a get request here, we will say that chances are they want to make a get request. So we will make sure that method says get. So if there is no method, like if a user did not pass in a method, say method should be get by default. And so this would accommodate for a case like, say, make AJAX request, and then we pass in like google.com as the URL. Or if we did something like get, like so. So in both cases, method would end up as get. In the first case, we did not pass in a method, so method would come in as undefined. And so we're checking to see if method is undefined here. If it is, then we're going to say, okay, they probably meant to make a get request here. So writing checks like this all over the place, like in a bunch of different functions, just assuming or trying to make our code a little bit more flexible, gets old really quick. And so the idea of default function parameters was added to ES6. With default function parameters, we no longer have to do an existence check on some argument like this and decide whether or not we want to assign it in case someone didn't actually pass that argument in. To make use of default function arguments, in the argument list of the function, so up here where it says method, we can say equals get. And what this does is by default, it'll say, okay, if the user did not pass in a method argument here, so if method is undefined, then it will automatically reassign method to get. So we will not, in the case that we pass in post, in this case right here, method will not get reassigned to get. It is only in the case that we do not provide method as an argument. It will be defaulted to the string get. So now we can test this out in practice. I'm just going to return method from here. And then so you'll notice that in the first case, when we first call it, we get returned because we defaulted method to get. But in the second case down here, we got post instead because method came in as post, and it will not be defaulted to the string get. So if you want to pass, let's say what happens in the case that you actually want to pass in a method of something like undefined, or you want to have like a null or nil type value. If that's the case, then I recommend you use null instead. So if you use null will not try to reassign method to get. Null is seen as null compared to undefined. They both mean, hey, there's no value here. But in JavaScript, by convention, we use null whenever we as a developer want to kind of say this is null, there's nothing exists here, and I as the developer want it to be that way. That's kind of where we use null as opposed to undefined. And so when we pass in null, method will not get reassigned, but if we manually passed in undefined, then yes, as a matter of fact, it does get reassigned to get. So that is default function arguments in a nutshell. Let's take a look at a little bit more complicated example in the next section.